back. So this lesson we're going to try and dive into promises versus observables, because Firebase uses both, and so does most software systems actually. So you might as well learn the difference between the two. So let's just start out just having a look at what's the idea behind making a promise and making an observable and why we even use them. So in our case, what I'm talking about is working or communicating with some kind of backend to get some data. So I want some data, I want to send some data, I want to talk to a backend somehow. That's why I use observables and promises. We can use it for other things, but that's my main focus right here. So what's going to happen is we need to somehow get data from here. And I've just made two simple clients right here. One of them is going to use a promise and the other is going to use an observable. Now let's just start with the promise one. What he's going to do is he's going to send the promise is going to send a request and say, I would like some data from you, dear server. He's going to send it over the wire. Somehow it's going to be passed over there. It's going to know where to go because of HTTP request or whatever we're using. And then it's going to go to the backend. Now here's the problem. The reason that we need to use promises is we don't know when we're going to get data back. We don't know when the data is being collected and completed so that we can get information back from the backend. To avoid freezing our application, so you know if you've ever tried using some kind of system where when you start typing and you get some data, everything freezes, you can't do anything, you're stuck, right? To avoid that, we kind of keep the data flow running. So we say this application can still execute, we just want to listen for when the server is done, he'll get an event back. Pretty much saying that now some time can pass by. Let's see if we have a clock right here. There we go. So now we don't know how much time will pass. So some time will go here, click, 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 click. While this passes, you can still work here because you're doing an asynchronous call. So you can still work. You can click other stuff. You can do crazy things. You can do whatever you want. At some point, the backend is saying, I'm done. I got some data for you. I'll just pass it back right here. Pass it over here first, doink. Then I'll pass it all the way back to you, shmoopsh. As soon as the data is back, a function inside the promise called then will be triggered, right? So that's the function that we will have a look at soon. So that's kind of the idea behind a promise. The promise is executed, an event is sent to the backend, some time will go by, but while we wait, we can still keep working here on the client. It's not going to freeze anything. At some point when the time has passed, the backend is going to return the data we requested, and then this function called then is being called. Okay? Now if something goes bad, if for some reason this guy ends up with an error instead of then, it's actually going to call catch inside the promise. So that's another function a promise provides for you, called catch. So again, we send an event, time goes by, we don't succeed, we get an error, but still we hit the promise and get a reply back, because else we would have to wait forever if we didn't get some kind of information. Now the final thing that you can actually get here is finally, pretty much just meaning that this should always be called, even though nothing happens, there might be a timeout, something like that. In the end, we'll end up calling finally, saying, I don't know, just execute this, just get this done, right? So that's the idea behind promises. These are the calls you can get inside a promise, and this is kind of the setup. So you have like 3 different methods that will be called. You have the catch, the finally, and the then inside a promise. Okay, so that's how promises function. Pretty easy stuff, but remember again, it's asynchronously, pretty much meaning that we do not know when we get a reply. We have to be ready that things won't just come synchronously right away. It'll be some kind of delay because we're talking to a backend. It might only be an eighth of a millisecond, but there's a delay. We cannot expect the data will come right away. That's very important stuff. So that's how promises work. How does observable works? Well, observables are a bit different, and we'll try and take the promise and convert it into an observable so you can see the differences. But before we do that, I think I want to start out just showing you how promises actually work in code. So we're going to try and do the exact same thing you see right here inside our code with the delete function. So let's jump back to our code. Now you'll notice right away the delete product function right here, it has a promise. The delete function says promise returned from delete is ignored. So that means that this is actually a promise that I'm executing right here. It's something that's provided for us inside the Angular Fire 2, but it's a promise that I can start working with. That should mean that if I do a dot right here, I should have my 3 methods available. You have the then method, the catch method, and the finally method available. Sweet, so I can start using them, right? So let's just try and see what the then method will do. then what it'll do is pretty much like you've done with subscribe. You can go in with the then method and say, I'm going to get some data back, I expect at least. So let's say in my case, I want to check out, I'm probably getting back the product I deleted. Maybe. I don't know what I'm getting back. I can't see that right now, but that's what I expect. So here I'm going to put in a debugger for now, just to kind of see what I'm actually getting back inside this method right here. So let's try and go and delete again, and hopefully I'll hit my debugger if I open up my console window. So again, what's going to happen is I'm going to send the promise, and the promise is, this is very important, the promise is being executed as soon as I do delete. So as soon as the promise is created, it's also being executed right away. Very important information because it's different with observables. But as soon as I execute a promise, as soon as I create a promise, it's being executed. So as soon as I call the delete function right here, a promise is created, executes the data, and I wait. And then when I'm done, I get and hit the then function if everything went a-okay. Let's try and see it in action right here. So I have my debugger, I have everything running right here. Let's jump into the debugger. And if I click the delete function right here for my ice cream, boom, I hit my breakpoint. And again, notice it took a bit of time. But the application wasn't frozen, while my machine wasn't frozen or anything while I waited. It just took a bit of time. And as soon as the server was done deleting my actual product, I got an event in the then right here. And notice I'm not getting anything back. So they actually didn't return anything for me right here. Even though they could have returned the product they deleted, they could have returned some information, but there's nothing in there. But I can still use this for something because I know that my product was deleted, so at least it's a notification that everything went well, your product is now deleted. Sweet. So that was the then function. So before we end this, I just want to kind of dive into the catch, and I also want to kind of have a look at the finally, which are the last two methods. So let's just have a look quickly here at the diagram again. The idea is pretty much, again, when we execute a promise, as soon as I call the delete function right here, this guy, then I will actually trigger a promise, sends an information to the backend. The backend will either return, if everything goes well, it'll return then, and if something goes horribly wrong, then I'll hit the catch function. So how do we put that into the code? And luckily, it's actually pretty simple. Again, we have the promise here first, then we have the then function, again from the diagram, right? And then we just need to add a catch. So it's pretty much the same idea. I'll just do a .catch right here, and this time it'll return an error if something goes wrong, and I can just put in the debugger right here again just to see that I actually catch that piece of information. Now, I might as well just tell you it's not going to happen with Firebase on the delete function right here, because even though when I put in some kind of ID here that's wrong, you might expect to get into the error because I couldn't delete that guy, but that's actually not how Firebase considers it. They actually say if you try to delete something like this, when I click this now, it'll trigger the event, and actually it will try to delete this guy. So let's try and delete it. Click. What will happen is actually still it returns the then saying that everything went well. Why? Because I just send in some gibberish ID, right? I send in this crazy ID that doesn't exist, and all Firebase actually does for me is just validate, you're right, this doesn't exist anymore, so I'm happy, I'll send back through that you guys did great. This deleted, this is now deleted, it doesn't exist in Firebase anymore, right? Because it never existed. So I don't get an error here, but it could be an error like you're trying to delete something that's being used somewhere else or something like that. You can make some functions that take care of stuff like this and catch and throw errors back if that's what you actually want. But not in this case, no, I didn't get an error, but that was how it would have worked. So if I went back to the diagram, I'd throw something using the promise, and over here it says, no, that's horribly wrong. It sends back an error, then I would hit the catch function. And now the finally function, which is the last one I want to show you for now, pretty much just means that this one will always be hit. Now it doesn't return anything, it's void, so it's just a way for me to kind of say I'm always going to end up in here, no matter what actually happens, I'm going to hit this function. Now you might hit this function in some cases after a timeout. It says in the end when I've timed out, I always end up here. Then I might not hit the then, I might not hit the catch, but I'll always end up here. So this, you can use this if you want to be sure that something was actually triggered somewhere, right? So you'll always end in here. Let's just prove that. Jumping back into my application with the finally and just trying to delete this guy. And you'll notice, if I continue here, you'll notice that I actually, when I delete, I actually first hit the then function saying that this was deleted. And then when I continue, I'll hit the finally function just saying that now I'm completely done with the promise. So that's it for promises. I know I could dive more into especially the catch, and I'll do that as soon as I get a good use case for it. See you next time. Have fun.